One of the things I stress on this show, and I feel never more natural in this show, is when we're talking about issues of war and peace. The compass is clear on that point. There is no conflict of what I think versus what I feel. Everything is in a certain alignment of being against the things that are creating more conflict, more wars. The reason why the world can't necessarily come together in this kind of kumbaya moment with bad actors. And I might look at this stuff in chess. I often say it's not about right or wrong. It's about action and consequence, especially when you're talking about international politics. That's usually gunboat diplomacy. And not just gunboat diplomacy, but right and wrong don't fully apply. It usually really does boil into action and consequence and what is in the best interest of a particular country or state. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States was willing to end the world if those missiles were going into Cuba. Those missiles were already in Cuba, and we would have set off, or the countries involved would have set off, a nuclear holocaust. We made it through the Cuban Missile Crisis purely by dumb luck. There wasn't this great agency involved. Yes, Jack Kennedy gave us a certain degree of space and luck to allow that luck to take hold. But it was dumb luck. In one case, there was a Soviet sub that thought it was being fired upon, thought the war had started, and took a vote on whether or not to initiate a launch. One guy, what's the difference? And then launching those missiles and saved the world. That said, I try to make the argument on this show that in the same way that we have certain things that drive us and incentives and things that we're concerned about and scared about, or things that we put our focus on, other nations are not that different. I've been jumping from place to place, and what I can tell you is people are pretty much the same everywhere with different cultural differences that kind of push the people in a particular way. But ultimately, the thing that makes a person is a person. And in the same way you can interact with people where you are, you can interact with people pretty much anywhere, because ultimately people are people everywhere. There may be cultural overlays, but they're still just human beings. I say that to say that in the same way we have concerns and fears about other nations, previously legitimate concerns and fears about other nations, those nations also have legitimate concerns and fears about us, especially with the tack that we've taken around the world. Oftentimes, people in the United States only look at it from the perspective of people in the United States, not taking into account that other nations have concerns and other nations have fears, especially about what we will do with this $1 trillion military. I want to make that clear, because when I talk about these issues, it's me not hugging anybody or taking a side. It's me just declaring this action is going to have a certain provocation or provocative effect, and the effect is going to be as clear as day. A joint statement was released by the United States Department of State, joint statement on Ukraine and United States strategic partnership. When you scroll down, there's this line: Ukraine reaffirmed that becoming a NATO member remains a strategic priority as recently enshrined in its legislation. The United States welcomes Ukraine NATO aspirations reaffirmed by the 2008 Bucharest Declaration and looked forward to one day welcoming Ukraine into the alliance. The United States reiterates its support for the Ukrainian effort to implement the security reforms detailed in the law on national security and commended the Ukraine in continuing contribution to the international peace and security operations throughout the globe. I love how they use so many words just as fluff. I guess I do the same thing, but theirs is usually used to deceive and to not say what they're actually saying. Ultimately, what this boils down to is there's a potential where Ukraine is trying to join NATO. The country that has been involved in this kind of proxy war with Russia is trying to join NATO. What would that do? Now, understand how we got here. The United States and Western allies, meaning the UK, France, all these other countries, backed a coup that took place in the Ukraine, removing the elected Russian-backed government with an unelected US and Western power-backed government, and fully backed it. Meaning the fact that this was a dethroning and a coup didn't matter to the West, because the West was firmly in the camp of being whatever is against Russia we love and backed the coup. Now, what is Russia to do here? The United States was willing to end the world if missiles were put into Cuba. What is Russia to do? 1 inch west, or whatever it was called. Supposedly, NATO wasn't supposed to expand at all. Understand, National Alliance Treaty Organization. It was there. It was put in place as a hedge against Soviet aggression, locking all of these nations in that if one is attacked, all will attack. Even for little Estonia, it would kick in processes that all of these countries will be provoked to action. It was supposed to stop what they consider to be Soviet aggression. Now, that's great. There is no Soviet Union. And so this sad man, NATO, is looking for a role to play in a world where Soviet Union doesn't exist. And the president, I think it was George Bush, had agreed that NATO wasn't going to move further. Now, the moment that George Bush lost, Clinton gets in office, and of course NATO continues to expand around the border of Russia. You have a hostile element that is on your border and that is expanding to multiple countries as they surround you with military instruments set for your destruction, making you that much more vulnerable and that much more insecure. What do you do? There's no right and wrong in this quiz. What do? You take certain actions to try to secure your borders. There have been multiple incursions into Russia, killing millions of people in those incursions by the West. What do you do if that was your country? I just told you, I had the conversation with the guy from Poland. And from his context, growing up in the Soviet Empire, he hated it. So this idea of NATO for him was a security blanket. But understand, NATO wasn't supposed to expand when the Soviet Union went belly up. What is the perspective then of somebody who lived in Russia who has family members that might have been involved in those incursions into Russian territory by Germans? And for that matter, they wouldn't necessarily remember it, but we've invaded Russia at one point, trying to put back the Tsar. I guess my point is, in the same way the guy from Poland has perspective, in the same way I have perspective, the people in that country are also going to have a particular perspective. And how do you, if you're the head of that country, secure its borders? The issue that took place in the Ukraine, to some degree, took place because of stuff like this. You're trying to put a military element on the border of the country. And the person who's in charge of securing that country fomented his own coup as a counter coup in order to take certain parts of the country in order to create a buffer zone between the two places. It makes sense from a military standpoint. I mean, what are you going to do? Allow a hostile element to be on your border? Again, JFK was willing to end the world with missiles being on the Cuban border. We fomented a revolution and is now going to put an organization that is meant for the destruction of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is gone, so you could say the Russian government, on the border of Russia. Not to mention you've gotten rid of the intermediate ballistics treaty. All of this stuff is hostile. All of this stuff is severe provocation. So, and by the way, this took place, I think, 7 days. Garland Nixon flagged the story for me. I think this took place like 7 days before the issue in the Kerch Strait, where the ships for the Ukrainians were seized. Is it related? I don't know. I would say the Ukraine joining NATO would be disastrous. It'd be utterly disastrous. So I'll leave this here. Keep in mind these guys are with gunboat diplomacy, and I still make the point that a war in this case will be a nuclear war. I don't know who made the quote, but said I can't imagine what weapons of destruction will be used in the next war, but I can tell you that the war after that is going to be sticks and rocks. Well, that's why. I'll end this here. Alright guys, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.